I just want to start off by welcoming everyone here today. This is our Florida Conversation series, and this is a very special Florida Conversations because we're actually doing this from the collection. This is a part of the museum that most people never get to see. Andy has been here as a historian. He's done some research here in our collection, but most people don't get to come down here. And since Andy just recently published his book about the history of Tampa, we thought, well, why don't we bring the good people down here? We'll throw some artifacts on the table and we'll do it from here. So this is a very special episode that we have here today. But I'd also like to thank our sponsors before we get started. Florida Conversations is brought to you by the Museum at Home program here at the Tampa Bay History Center, which is presented by Raymond James. And we thank them for helping us provide digital and virtual programming for the community, such as this, when we get to try new things. We would also like to thank another sponsor that we have, which is Sable Trust, and we greatly appreciate them helping us deliver a very special edition of this Florida Conversations from right here in the collection. So let's kick it off. Andy, we're here to talk about your book. It's great. You and I have talked about it before, and I have it here on the table, and it is entitled From Saloons to Steakhouses, A History of Tampa. I'm going to bring it in real slow so people can take a look there. It's a great book. I've known Andy for quite a while now, actually. He's helped me with a lot of research that I've done. He is a librarian at the University of South Florida, and he publishes about Florida history. He publishes things about food, about Tampa, and other aspects of Florida's very rich past. So with that, what we're going to do today is really have Andy take you on a tour of his book. And I'm just going to supplement the things he's going to say today with some of the items that we have here from our collection. But before I show you some of the stuff and get us kicked off today, Andy, I just wanted to start with a general question. You decided that you wanted to look at the history of Tampa in a very different way. You wanted to look at restaurants. You wanted to look at saloons. Why did you decide that's how you wanted to tell the history of Tampa?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the sponsors as well. And I want to thank the History Center and all you guys at the History Center, CJ, Nancy, Manny, and then you, Brett, of course, Rodney. I also want to thank my colleagues in the USF libraries. Without their support, I wouldn't have been able to get the book done when I did. So so that's huge. But yeah, I guess as a student, I saw a lot of other people kind of taking the most obvious route and really direct routes into history, like I'm just going to write about racism or something like that, which is all great. But I wanted something a little more nuanced and something that hadn't been explored as much. So I was able to get at a lot of the serious issues in a roundabout way, I think, through this research. But I was also really just, I was always intrigued by Tampa's history because there's a lot of references to a colorful history there. But I never really saw that history in front of me. So, you know, and they talked about how Tampa was Sin City of the South, but I never seemed to see anyone having fun. So I guess, you know, someone in there, you know, was out and about and doing things and being crazy. So for me, you know, I wanted to show rather than tell. I guess that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think you do that in the book, and I definitely think you do so successfully. And in your early chapters of the book, you talk about the beginning of saloon life and culture. And so I have a couple things here I just wanted to show everybody in our audience today, and then turn it over to you to tell us about some of the great stories. And, you know, you can't have a very wet town, which Tampa is. It's a very wet town without having booze. And we have here in our collection a few things, and these are from the early brewers and distillers here in Tampa. This is a bottle from the Florida Brewing Company. I'll just bring that in so everybody can take a look. A really, really old bottle we have in here in the collection. The other thing I wanted to show you, or show everybody at home before I turn it over to you, Andy, is this is a jug from somebody that you write about in your book, a man by the name of Muggy, who becomes very important in Tampa saloon culture. And he's going to be involved in fighting blue laws, Sunday laws, some of these other things that you write about at length. So with that, you know, how does saloon life and culture really kick off here in Tampa? You know, what does Muggy have to do with that? And what does the Florida Brewing Company have to do with that?
Right. Well, if you want to look at Tampa's cultural and political life in, say, the 1890s, and really I begin this book when Ybor City is founded and Tampa annexes Ybor City, and makes it part of the city, which the city fathers of Tampa said they never were going to do, by the way, but then they did. And the reason is because they didn't have a police force, Ybor City. So the idea of Tampa lending a hand with its police force is pretty funny if you kind of know what the police force was like at the time. But like I said, to really understand the city's life in the 1890s, you have to understand the saloon culture. And really, at this time, Tampa was growing really quickly, and in every boomtown, alcohol was a major factor, in just kind of being one of the only diversions in a lot of these places. So for lack of a real kind of culture, the saloons sort of filled the bill, and so they became really the place for men to socialize outside of work. And it was really considered masculine to drink to excess. It was considered a masculine pastime that men were going to do,
Andy,
pretty much no matter what. Yeah.
This is a great story you tell. I just had to interrupt you because you talk about one thing that people get arrested for a lot during this period is passing out in public, right? That they're passed out on public land.
Right. Yeah, and I always found it was really interesting to go through the microfilm and the old newspapers and see what the blotter was like every Monday morning, because they didn't. A lot of times they wouldn't print the newspaper on Sunday, or they wouldn't print all the news. So on Mondays is when you got like all the arrests that happened over the weekend and how many people passed out and things like that. So yeah, and the alcohol problem was not exaggerated. I mean, there definitely was a nationwide drinking problem, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that authorities really weren't regulating the places correctly. So a lot of the places that made a bad name for saloons were places that they weren't even saloons. They were speakeasies before their time, places that weren't paying taxes, that kind of thing. So they set the tone for all the legitimate businesses too, really. So the first chapter is where I really deal with that culture and the Sunday laws. And, for those unaware, I think everyone could probably remember a time when we had some kind of Sunday law. You couldn't buy alcohol before 1 p.m., things like that. So the Sunday law was really strict, and it was written right into Florida's constitution, into his territorial constitution, which carried over to when it was a state. And the idea was you weren't allowed to do anything on Sunday. Only policemen were allowed to make money on Sundays, to give you an idea. So, the idea that you couldn't print newspapers, you couldn't ride on a train, all those things. And what's interesting is that every local community sort of dealt with that in a different way. Every sheriff would apply those laws in a different way. And it really didn't seem to be a problem until immigrants came and had a different idea of how you spent a Sunday. So suddenly going out on Sundays, eating, drinking, playing games, all that stuff was really popular here in Tampa. And a very vocal minority in the elite, I think, was really upset by it. And it really, that conflict roiled the community for years, really to no good end. But the next chapter, I talk about the Spanish-American War here in Tampa. I think a lot of people know that the troops spent a lot of time here before they actually went to Cuba, spent more time in Tampa often than they did in Cuba itself. And, in each chapter I found a hidden something or other. For me, the one of the Spanish-American War chapter was Tampa's link to the canned meat scandal. It was called the embalmed beef scandal. And for several years, Congress was studying this problem that we had given basically inedible food to soldiers, this really bad canned beef. And I had no idea that it all had to do with this kind of huckster that came down here to Tampa and said that he had a method for preserving beef, and brought down a few sides of beef to try to get them on supply ships because he really wanted a contract with the U.S. military, with the War Department, to supply beef to all the troops. Long story short, he was such a show-off that he took one of these sides of beef and strung it up over a ship, one of the supply ships, and in the sun for everyone to see, claiming that it would not spoil because he had fumigated it with sulfur, which probably didn't do much for the smell of the beef. but long story short, General Nelson Miles, who was in charge, largely in charge of the invasion of Cuba, when he saw that beef, he assumed that was the beef that was in the canned beef that was actually being fed to the soldiers at the time. So that misunderstanding meant that he testified to Congress that he saw this embalmed beef that was actually being used in the canned beef, which wasn't true. That didn't mean that the canned beef was edible. But then there's a lot of other stuff about what happens here in Tampa with the troops, and that it wasn't always a very pleasant stay. So in the third chapter is when I talk more about graft and corruption. I also talk about Boleta in that chapter, and kind of the foundation of kind of a corrupt civic structure here in Tampa, and I know Brad has something fun to show us. What do you have over there, Brad?
Yeah, I have a Boleta set. So I just wanted to show everyone. A lot of people that know about the history of Tampa know that Boleta was incredibly important for Tampa history and culture, and also for enriching criminals and the police. Boleta was a game that everyone was in on. I'm just going to take a ball. This is one of the sets that we have here at the History Center. And it was basically a lottery game. So Boleta collectors would go around. I'm going to focus in on that for you right there. And you would basically buy a number. This is number 100. And then I'm sure you'll tell the people about this, Andy, but basically then they'd be put into a bag. It would be shook up, and then there would be Boleta pulls. And you talk a little bit about this in your book. And, why is Boleta so important when it comes to saloons, steakhouses, and food culture and drinking culture here in Tampa?
Right. Well, it's one of the institutions that was brought over with the Cubans, and it was a favorite pastime in Cuba. There was a national lottery in Cuba. The U.S. actually did away with it when the U.S. occupied Cuba. It was brought back a couple decades later, and then it was done away with again by Castro when he came to power. But so it's a very durable institution in Cuba, at least until 1959. And it really set the tone for Tampa. That's one of the things that really I can't come away with looking back on writing this book, is how much of an influence Havana and the culture there had on Tampa, much more so than, say, Sicilian culture or Spanish culture. Cuban culture cast the biggest shadow, and certainly injected the most color into the community here, and vibrancy. But especially because there were so many more Cubans initially than there were in these other ethnic groups. But in that third chapter, I talk about, theater of shadows and this kind of cat and mouse game between police, the fact that Ybor City and every major ward in Tampa elected their own constable. So basically you could elect your own local sheriff, and the ones who were elected to Ybor City really tended not to care much about gambling, and those were the people who were reelected constantly. So it was an interesting system, and one that was very vulnerable to corruption. But the thing that really surprised me in that chapter was I looked into Louis Athanasaw, who was a Greek immigrant and had a place called the Imperial Theater in Fort Brooke initially, and then later in Tampa. But he was kind of the impresario of flesh, here in Tampa when it came to nude dancing or semi-nude dancing. And what I knew that he ran an interesting theater, but what I didn't know was that his case, he had a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was a test case for the White Slave Act, or the Mann Act. I had no idea. So suddenly I had all these written transcripts about what he had done wrong. It's basically a sexual harassment case, and the guy was a total creep. But he didn't actually break the law, if that makes any sense. You have to read the book. But in the fourth chapter, I look at unions, and I know that the cigar industry has been looked at pretty exhaustively in some respects, especially around like the institution of the lector, the readers, and the unions and stuff like that. But I think one thing that really surprised me was the collective enterprises that these unions came up with. So the soup kitchens, whenever they were on strike to feed the feeding workers, but then you also had cooperative restaurants and cooperative groceries and things like that popped up. So that's one of the things that I had never seen covered before, and really how the wholesalers and the retailers here in Tampa were very threatened by this. And it was happening right after World War I, when the Red Scare was very much with us. So this whole idea of cooperative businesses kind of reeked of Bolshevism for a lot of people. And I understand you have some interesting stuff having to do with World War I. And I always thought it was interesting, Brad, that very little has been written about World War I in Tampa. And that's one thing, like I had no ideas about what to write about during that period initially. And I started to do some research, and I came across, I think, an interesting angle. But tell us what you have there.
Yeah, I think you did. But if I could just back up for a second, I remember I was lucky enough to read an early version of your book. And when I did, that soup house in the collective chapter really stood out. It's such a great chapter. It really pulls together that moment of, this labor animosity between owners and workers. But yeah, going to World War I, you've written about this. You also had an article published in the Quarterly about it. And it's really interesting. As you say, there hasn't been much written. So you decide you're going to focus on a place that's really important in Tampa. And that's this. We're going to get this into focus for you. This is the German American Club. This is a postcard of the old German American Club. And then the other thing we have that I'm going to bring over for people that are interested in flatware history.
Right.
This is a plate of the German American Club. And the reason I wanted to show the people this is the back. And this will be hard to zoom in on, but it says here on the back, made in Germany, basically for Tampa, Florida. So I don't know if we can zoom in on that, Teresa. But this is a really cool piece, and it speaks to what you write about, which is there's this German hysteria in Tampa. There's this fear of the German immigrant, and the German immigrant's going to undermine the experience. And one thing I wanted you to talk a little bit about is how Germans are going to use bread to undermine the American war effort here in Tampa. Can you tell us a little bit about the buttery bread controversy?
Well, they weren't going to use bread so much as glass. And what's so interesting about it is, there's this anti-war hysteria, and it really can't be overstated just how exaggerated it was, and that, what a little bit of fear does to the imagination. So people had all these imaginary things that the Germans were capable of, superhuman feats of bringing down American industry. Who knows how, but so one of the ways that they were supposedly going to undermine the war effort was to contaminate the food supply with glass. So, and what's so interesting and novel about this is most of the time you see people dying from eating glass, it's in fiction. There's not many examples, and I did find a couple where people like committed suicide by eating glass, like they were, they knew what they were doing. But it's very, very difficult to give someone glass and so this idea that, if you grind up glass into someone's food, if you grind it up small enough that they don't notice it, it's just sand, but people were convinced that bread everywhere and all the food, anything that was, canned food could have glass in it. So people started imagining glass in everything. There was some guy in Tallahassee, I checked the state records of everything they inspected for these years during World War I. And there was one guy that I think sent in 100 different samples. So I think he was just going out and just looking for glass. And most of the time, what did you find in the can? It was sand. There might have been some sand in it or some crystallized sugar or something like that. So it's really funny, but it's not really funny when you look at how the press took the story and really kept passing it along as something true. And so for every time a newspaper said, oh, this isn't actually happening, people aren't dying from eating glass, 100 other papers were reprinting yesterday's story. So what you had was this situation where everyone was convinced there's glass. And what ended up happening here in Tampa, it's still really difficult exactly to tell, but there was bakers who were making war on one another by basically making bread, putting glass in it, and then using the other guy's wrappers. And then so everyone would think that that bakery had a saboteur or something like that. So no German baker in this country was safe. There was probably tens of thousands of German bakers who either went out of business or were fired or whatever. And Allen's Buttercrust Bread, this is the name of a really popular bakery here in Tampa. The first thing he did was fired his 19-year-old German worker, assuming that he was behind it. So there's this whole story, and it really goes to the national level where even the Attorney General is alarmed that they can't get any real work done because people are constantly calling in about glass in bread. The other thing, to show you how ridiculous the whole thing is that somehow German women were lacing bandages with broken glass, so that if there's all these women who were learning to bind wounds and use gauze and all this other stuff, and that the gauze and everything might have glass in it too, So this is the power of suggestion, and really the German club ended up here in Tampa bore the brunt of that. Besides the bakery, the German club itself, and I think what's interesting is the night that kind of the police let the populace here in Tampa trash the place and drag all the stuff out of the club into the street and everything. Neither newspaper elected to write about it. So that night and how exactly it happened and why is all lost to history. But there are a lot of other kind of ugly incidents that I document having to do with the mayor at the time and other stuff. And it's to me, it's a really fascinating thing, but it all began with me looking for something about devil crabs. And I found a devil crab man in 1918 who was arrested for having glass in his bread. Wow. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I kind of pulled on that thread a little bit, and it ended with the Attorney General complaining about this nationwide problem. So this, to me, that was an interesting find for World War I and a different take on it.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because just to reiterate what you're saying, there's this unfortunate incident where these workers are commuting home and they have to get on a rowboat to cut across the channel, and the boat sinks, and a bunch of them end up dying because they can't swim. And then there's a German man that gets blamed for that. So yeah, the hysteria kind of gets worked up in a lot of different ways. But, we were talking a little bit about World War I, but then you also write about World War II in your book, and you talk about juke joints and some of these other things that add to the area's food and your food and saloon culture. You want to talk a little bit about those places?
Yeah, I found the whole juke joint thing fascinating. For those who aren't aware, they're kind of these places for kind of social congregation on work sites. And really, I learned a lot from an article that was written in 1940 by Theodore Pratt, and it's called The Land of Jukes. And he wrote it for the Saturday Evening Post, I believe. But it was really a shameful article, basically that the jukes existed in order to make agriculture in Florida bearable for the African Americans who were pretty much pressed into working in that industry. And that, that's the only reason the jukes existed, was basically to keep people on site. And it began with probably the turpentine industry here in Florida, as far as we know, but it spread all across the Deep South, so that, every crossroads near plantations would have a juke joint so that people on Saturday night would have a place to recreate. But they were rough places. There was a lot of killing going on. And during World War II, it sort of became public enemy number one. And it really was before that. All the way back in 1937, several years before the war, there was the Dance Hall Act was passed, which was really aimed at these places, because saloons were bad enough. Before Prohibition, saloons were, the big public enemy. But jukes were worse, because women went to jukes too. So men and women would get inebriated and do what men and women do. So during World War II, this was a huge problem. So there was a big clamp down on these places. But what I've really found out about juke joints too was that they were really cultural incubators, and that like all the regional blues styles and dance styles and everything were all developed in these juke joints, before the days of recorded music and all that stuff. So there's a there's a lot of beauty in that story, but there's a lot of ugliness too. And then, we can't skip over Prohibition, which, of course happened before World War II, and really was one of the most fun chapters. I think I ended up with like 100 pages and had to cut it quite a bit because there was just so much stuff going on here. And really one of the things I'm proud of with the book is sort of is kind of getting at stories, and pulling these stories out and things that people can learn from. So the story of Leo Stalnaker, known as the arsenic judge, who was like probably the driest judge Tampa ever saw up to that point, and his meteoric rise and fall in Tampa's political scene is really fascinating. And we had some great sources in special collections. We actually got a scrapbook that a court clerk who was a big fan had put together. So that was a huge help in my research. And then I understand you have something on Bartkeys, which was a really great post-war chapter, I thought. It's not as seedy as the others, but it's interesting though.
Yeah, Bartkeys is great. And I was thinking about the interesting thing about your Prohibition chapter is, we started off with talking about the Sunday laws, right? And these blue laws. And then you see that follow into the 1930s and the 1920s and 30s, this attempt to try to police people's behavior. But
right.
Yeah, fast forwarding to the Cold War, which is, for people that know me, I have a soft spot for the Cold War in my heart. This is Bartkeys. And this was a really famous Tampa steakhouse that was in the airport. And this is the menu. And for the good people, Andy, I'm just going to flip it open so they could take a look and see what you can actually get here at Bartkeys and what the prices were. I don't know if we can zoom in close enough, but I'll give people an idea, Teresa.
Yeah, and just so you know, it looks like $3 for the chicken meal. That was expensive at the time. This was not a cheap restaurant.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I think the most expensive thing was the broiled filet mignon.
Right.
But what can you tell us about Bartkeys? It was interesting when I read your book for the first time. At first, to be honest with you, Andy, I was surprised. I'm surprised that this steakhouse got a whole chapter. But then when I read the book, it really started to come together, and I was like, oh, I see it. So, what's your answer to everybody out there? Why'd you want to write a whole chapter about this place?
Right. I just couldn't find another place that really kind of personified or brought to life the era in which it lived. So the 1950s. There's so many different things that run through this story that I felt like it really belonged. First of all, the family is from upstate New York. They have a very successful restaurant up there, and the mother gets injured, or the child, she had a sickness or something. So they both come down to Treasure Island to spend some time away from the restaurant. And the mother basically, Alva Bartkey was her name. I would love to have been able to meet her, but she basically just told her husband, we're going to open a restaurant down here, by the way, and we're going to move to Florida. Not asking, telling. And well, whatever happened, I think first look at the Bay Area at the time, this was in the late 40s, was enough for him. So they decided they were going to open a restaurant down here, largely because I think there wasn't a lot of competition. There were not a lot of really seasoned restaurateurs, and Frank Bartkey was definitely a seasoned one. He was probably one of the first in the area, besides the Latin restaurants like in Ybor City, that were actually aging steaks. I don't know if the Columbia was aging steaks. I don't think so at that time. So he was one of the first. He also had something called the Gretchen Broiler-matic, which is this broiler that could basically, if you cut the steaks to to a certain size, that it would cook them perfectly depending on which slot you put them in. But what I love about Bartkeys is sort of like there's this endless optimism of the 1950s, that kind of leisure and tourism and technology is going to solve like all of our problems, So what I found really interesting is we had a scrapbook that was devoted to Bartkeys and special collections, and So I could see like all the different events that were happening there week after week. And, you know, one of the things I found was someone giving a talk about nuclear power and claiming that we were sitting on a huge bed of uranium here in Tampa, which of course never really surfaced. But then the other idea that they were talking about was to use atomic bombs to stop hurricanes, which I could only, you know, imagine what would result adding more heat to that, you know, to the heat sink of the Gulf. But then the other thing was there was a lot of shadows in the 1950s. You know, I mean, on the one hand, you had this family moving down from upstate New York. Eventually, their restaurant burns down in New York City, and they kind of put in all their stuff here. So they start with Treasure Island, but eventually they open up a steakhouse in Tampa International Airport. So Tampa International Airport opens in the early 1950s. It's in 1952, I think. There was a brand new terminal that was built, and so Bartkeys was part of that terminal. And it's a great story about all kinds of optimism, but then there's also this really heartbreaking part where one of the daughters, I was able to interview a couple of the daughters who grew up working there, where she talks about contracting polio. And, you know, of course, the moment the community hears that she has polio, nobody wants to go to that restaurant, assuming that, you know, there's a problem. So that was a kind of a dramatic moment in the chapter too, but it's a much more wholesome chapter than a lot of the other ones that I have. But I thought it was, it told you enough about Tampa that it belonged, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, yeah,
Andy,
and then,
if I can interrupt you just for a second. One
sure,
thing we wanted to do is we wanted people to submit questions. So if they have a question, they can submit a
please
question
do.
Q&A. And I've just been told that I think one question just came across. So if you'd like to answer it.
Sure, hit me.
The juke joint? Yeah, so someone was just wondering, Andy, you know, is there a relationship between the notion of the juke joint and a jukebox? Are those things related?
Right. Okay. So, right, the juke originally, like I said, was just a place, but it was a place to drink, and mostly for music and dancing and pursuit of the opposite sex. So the jukebox became sort of a cheap way to have a juke. The original jukeboxes supposedly was the packing crates for pianos. So the piano, like if you were running a Turpentine, you know, a plantation or something, I would order a train car, and that would act as the juke joint. So I didn't have to build anything. I could just bring in a train car and just leave it on the track, and then have a piano put in there, and then a little bar. So then the piano would be used, and it would only be used on like Fridays and Saturdays, and then the rest of the week it would be boarded up. So they would keep the packing crate and board it up at the end of the weekend every week, supposedly. So the original jukeboxes, that was the jukebox. So, but they called these new kind of automatic coin-operated record players jukeboxes as sort of a replacement. You also have to think like Juke was a new spelling for Jook. Originally, you know, juke is like probably an African word, which means to misbehave in a wicked manner, supposedly. And it was a little too African to put onto something like this, so that it was changed from Juke, you know, into that. But it's, you know, juke is the same thing as like honky tonk. One of these, you know, these words that kind of got used to describe these places. But did I answer the question?
Yeah. No, you definitely did.
Right.
And like I said, anyone that has a question, Andy would be happy, you know, to try to answer it for us. And
the jukebox. So in the 30s, yeah, it became like a replacement for a band. So like if you were running a bar, you could just get the jukebox and like, here, you can play the juke, you know. But it was really a stand-in for a juke joint with actual musicians. But like people like Muddy Waters, they all cut their teeth in juke joints, playing usually for free drinks, until you got, you know, once you got successful enough to make money, you wouldn't play in jukes anymore. You'd play in real bars and places like that. So
yeah. All right, well, I was thinking, Andy, maybe we'll transition to one of the last things we wanted to talk about, which is another restaurant. And this is a really interesting place because you use it to tell the story about an important Tampa family, the Garcia family. And then you also use this place to talk about urban renewal, which is really urban destruction. And
Right.
that is this place, Las Novedades. And this is an old menu. Some of y'all, depending on your age, you might remember this place in Ybor City. And
Oh,
like the
yes.
Bartkeys menu, let's just take a look at some of these prices, basically just because I'm interested. But take a look. This is the inside of the menu. I don't know if we can zoom in on that, Teresa, get everybody a look. And the other thing I wanted to say, Andy, like y'all up in special collections, you know, a lot of people would think, well, why is a menu in a museum or a collection? But for a food historian such as yourself, you know, these things are incredibly important, right? Because they
Right.
help tell the story.
Oh, absolutely.
So with that, you know, what can you tell us about this restaurant? You know, I don't want to ask you the same question, but you've written about the Columbia before. You probably know more about the Columbia than any other historian. Um, what do we need to know about this restaurant? Why is it so important in Tampa history, and what does its story tell us?
Well, they were once partners with the Columbia back in the 20s. Really, they kind of allowed the Columbia to transition from being a full-time saloon to being a restaurant. Um, so that was really important. So during the 1920s, they were both partners and merged their businesses together. They eventually split in the early 1930s. But yeah, the Las Novedades is one of the oldest restaurants in Tampa. It opened originally in 1890. And had a real pedigree. And then when the Garcia family picked up on it, they didn't previously have any history with it, but they bought the restaurant and kind of resurrected it in Ybor City, and it became really one of the favorites here in town. I mean, along with the Columbia, it was those were the two big ones, and there was a couple others like Spanish Park, places like that, but those are the two big ones. So and you know, run by an interesting family. And really, that last chapter to me is so fascinating because there are so many things. It's sort of like the Bartkeys chapter, but for the 1970s, where you've got like fast food, you know, there's ghosts and seances and all kinds of, you know, interesting stories and all, you know, off the wall type stuff. So it's really interesting to see the Garcia family rather than kind of double down on the Spanish Las Novedades concept. They get into Burger King and they make a huge amount of money in Burger King in Orlando and across Central Florida. So there's a great interesting story there. But then you've got, like, you know, gay bars become, you know, the old Las Novedades becomes a gay bar in the mid 1970s, and that's kind of interesting because it brings organized crime into the equation, because at the time organized crime really ran the biggest gay bars here at Tampa and in Florida, and there's intense competition between them where they were, you know, flaming each other, bombing each other, etc. So it was a real serious cutthroat business at the time. So there's all this stuff is going on in the midst of urban renewal and trying to get Ybor City like back on its feet again. But I always felt like the city fathers were a little conflicted about what they wanted Ybor City to be, and that they weren't really comfortable with what it once was, like this kind of bastion of radical politics and labor and all this other stuff. So I always felt like there was an ambivalence about what the city really wanted to do there, and that's how you get, like, you know, public housing in Ybor City and some of the other things. Even the campus of HCC, you know, I don't know, you could argue whether or not it's a real asset or not, but you know, that's all water under the bridge now. But it's just an interesting chapter, and there's so much going on, and I don't want to skip over the second to last chapter, which is about the integration of the lunch counters, which I really found fascinating too. And although it had been written about here and there's not many books that really look at that campaign from start to finish. And the other thing that I felt good about was to be able to bring USF and the history of USF kind of into that story, because, you know, a lot of the kind of Southern legislators that were trying to impede integration, they were really afraid of having a university here in the Tampa Bay area that might tip the balance in favor of integration, and their fears ended up being well founded. But you have to check out the book to read about that. But yeah, I don't want to go over time or anything. If there's any questions, or Brad, if you have anything you want to ask.
Yeah, we have a few. Somebody's going to read them to me, and then I'm going to read them out to you, Andy.
Okay.
About El Goya.
There's a question about El Goya.
Can you talk a little bit about El Goya?
Yeah, El Goya, which of course I don't want to answer the question, but it's that transitional moment, and El Goya is ultimately burned down, isn't it, Andy, by an arsonist?
Well, it's burned, but not burned down, right? So there was an attempted arson, and it was partly burned, but the building wasn't completely consumed with fire. But it was, yeah, and it was a hit by another, an owner of another gay bar that tried to put it out of business. But yeah, and it burned twice. So it wasn't just once that the El Goya, almost burned down. It was twice. And what I found really interesting is they had a grand jury investigation because everybody was burning their buildings down in Ybor City. They were building their own, burning their own buildings down for insurance and stuff like that. And then on top of that, you had these clubs who were, firebombing each other. What's interesting, they're having a grand jury investigation, and during that week, there's an arson attempt on the El Goya. And, people were saying whoever was doing it was just to show that, like, they didn't care there was a grand jury going on, and it was just a big, flipping off, law and order in Ybor City. So, the craziness goes on and on.
Yeah. Let's check and see if we have any other questions. Do we have any other questions, Manny?
There's something else that could be written about more, is that whole insurance fraud in Ybor City in the 1970s. Whew.
Yeah, I mean, don't even get me started. As you know, Andy, I do research on Tampa as well. And in the 1930s, right, they're burning everything down. I mean, there's what they called firebugs back then, are all around the city. I do think Manny has one question.
How is food tied to tourism, especially when we talk about a seafood restaurant, but also like Ybor City?
So the question was, how is Tampa's food culture tied to tourism, especially when it comes to places like Ybor City, but also, seafood. We are here on the bay. So what's the tie between food and Tampa's tourist economy?
Right. Well, one of my big regrets is that I had a whole food chapter that we didn't have room for in the book. And ultimately, I felt like going with the chapters I went with was the right choice. And I still agree with that. The other chapter what didn't make it in the book was about the Seawolf restaurant and Gene Holloway, which, he was cursorily involved with all these King Tiger people. What is it, Tiger King? So it would have been nice to have it in the book, probably, after all. But with the food culture, the thing is I think Tampa becomes aware of food being an asset to recruit tourists early on. Tampa is a hugely ambitious city. So they're already talking about, in 1880s, now that the cigars are here, we're going to become the queen of the Gulf, bigger than New Orleans, bigger than, Jacksonville, et cetera. So there was a lot of delusions of grandeur, I think, early. Excuse me, restate the question for me again. It just ran away from me. Oh, yeah, the tourism, of course. So from an early time, they're talking about this, and it really becomes big in the 1920s. So when you have the Florida land boom going on, and this intense speculation into Florida land and property, et cetera, that's when really the Tampa Tribune, the Tampa Daily Times kind of go into overdrive, like, let's really push this food thing. So like Spanish bean soup becomes one of the first things, but then of course there's the Cuban sandwich, devil crabs, etc. But I'd say the big ones were, the soup and the Cuban sandwich. So by the 1930s, like, they're already like taunting other places. Like Atlanta doesn't have a Cuban sandwich, this city doesn't have this. Oh, we just heard somebody in Washington D.C. had sandwiches airlifted to them. So there's a lot of that going on, and a lot of chest beating about food. But it tended to be pretty narrow, and just talking about a couple dishes that wouldn't offend Yankee sensibility. So it's like chicken and yellow rice, things that are kind of already familiar. And they're not going to go into like, you should have the crawfish with cream sauce or something. I don't think they're going to do that. They're not going to mention things like garlic,
like they're looking for an in-between cuisine, somewhere between Havana and, you know, Maine. They want something in between. I think
And
we
I
have
think
one other question.
What is Tampa's oldest operating bar?
What is Tampa's oldest operating bar? Do you know that one, Andy?
no, not offhand. Yeah, originally I wanted to write just about bars, and there's not a lot of information there. So, but no, I don't know offhand. I mean, the Columbia's bar,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be the oldest. One interesting thing when I was writing the book with the Columbia restaurant, about 10 years ago, they discovered in the midst of me writing this that they only had like a small fraction of the building actually zoned to serve alcohol. So all these years that they had been like expanding through that city block, now they have a city block as 2 stories.
Yeah.
They were only zoned for like one little corner, like the old cafe. So every time they expanded, they never actually like paid to have that expanded or anything. So they were still spending like, 1920s rates or, for their space, even though they were a much bigger space. And it's interesting because, of course, no one in the family could remember how it got that way. It just had always been that way, and the city sort of neglected to collect the money. So it's really interesting. So, I mean, that's how things like that happens, or Zion Cemetery goes missing, those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me check and see if we have any other questions. Manny and Amanda, do we have any other questions? Yeah. Oh, so I know you know a lot about Turpentine. You know I know a lot about Turpentine, but one of the questions we just got is, what is this Turpentine? Where are these Turpentine labor, which were really plantations? Can you tell people a little bit about the turpentine industry in Florida?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's for making mineral spirits, right? I don't know. You can tell them what turpentine is. I'll tell them what the juke joints were like. How about that?
So yeah, the turpentine industry, they would basically tap pine trees, and they would get chemicals out of them to make what they called navel stores, which, yeah, mineral spirits, basically things along that line. And it was a very difficult job, and that's why the juke joints popped up, next to them. That's where the workers would go to blow off steam, and some of those workers were even incarcerated in the old turpentine work camps.
Yeah, and these, those work camps, people were constantly trying to escape. So that's how the juke joint started, was like, okay, you'll have a place to drink. And then like, there's even accounts of like the turpentine, like a plantation owner actually using a train to bring in women for the weekend to make sure that the men didn't leave just to find a woman. So there's that kind of thing going on too. So, and that's where supposedly the whole thing began, right? And it became like best practice across the South. This is what you did to keep your workers on site, basically.
Yeah, and they became such really reviled places. Hurston, the author of Their Eyes Were Watching God, she does an anthropological study of the turpentine industry here in Florida. Do we have any other questions, Annie or Amanda? Well, we don't have any other questions, so what I'd like to do, Andy, is I just want to wrap it up. I, of course, want to talk one more time about from saloons to steakhouses. Here, I'm bringing in extreme close-up, Wayne's World style. There we go. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Sable Trust, for sponsoring tonight's event, and of course,
thank you,
sponsoring our Museum from Home program. And then, Andy, I just want to give you the floor for the last second here, and just thank you for joining us today.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. And I really can say that the journey was better than the destination. I mean, just taking a deep dive into Tampa history to do this book, I learned an awful lot, and I hope people enjoy it.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time at Florida Conversations.
Thanks, guys. Thank everybody out there in internet land.